The courtroom revelation. The warm light of a January morning streamed through the towering windows of courtroom 3B. Judge Daniel Monroe adjusted his black robes with the precision of a man who found solace in routine. For over 2 decades, he had presided over cases with an unflappable demeanor, carving out a reputation as fair, deliberate, and unshackably composed. But today, a peculiar weight hung in the air, an inexplicable unease he couldn't quite shake. The gallery was unusually full for a routine custody hearing. Rows of spectators filled the benches, murmuring in low tones. Lawyers shuffled their papers at the front of the room, and a young girl stood off to the side, flanked by her attorney. She couldn't have been older than 12, her dark brown skin luminous under the sunlight pouring in. Her braids were neatly tied with blue ribbons, but her small hands nervously gripped the hem of her cardigan. Judge Monroe scanned the room, his gavel in hand. "We'll begin," he announced, his voice carrying an authority that instantly silenced the whispers. "This is the matter of Leila Hart," he began. "We are here to determine guardianship following the tragic passing of her mother, Ms. Celeste Hart. Does the petitioner wish to proceed?" Leila's lawyer, a tall woman in her late 30s named Ms. Gaines, stepped forward. "Your Honor, before we proceed with standard testimony, my client would like to address the court directly." The judge paused, his brow furrowing slightly. This was unorthodox, especially for a child. He glanced down at Leila, whose wide eyes met his with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "Is that correct?" he asked her gently, his tone softening. "Yes, sir," Leila replied. Her voice trembled but held a quiet strength that belied her age. Ms. Gaines gave the girl an encouraging nod. Leila walked to the witness stand, her footsteps echoing in the hushed room. She climbed onto the chair, barely tall enough to reach the microphone. Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly. "Take your time, Miss Hart." Leila glanced around the room, her gaze briefly settling on the crowd of strangers before returning to the judge. Her lips pressed together as though gathering courage. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "You're my dad." The words landed with the force of a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the gallery, and whispers broke out like wildfire. The judge's grip tightened on the edge of his bench, as though the world itself had shifted beneath him. I'm sorry, what did you say?" Judge Monroe stammered, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "You're my dad," Leila repeated, her voice firmer this time. "You're my father. My mom told me before she died." For a man whose life revolved around maintaining control, this moment unraveled him. His typically stoic expression cracked, a cascade of emotions flashing across his face. Shock, confusion, disbelief. The courtroom noise grew louder as reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The bailiff banged his gavel to restore order, but the damage was done. "Order!" The judge finally barked, his voice regaining some of its usual command. He turned to Leila's lawyer. "Ms. Gaines, what is the meaning of this?" Ms. Gaines stepped forward again, her face calm but resolute. "Your Honor, my client has evidence to support her claim. She believes you are her biological father. She has asked for the opportunity to present this information privately before the court." Judge Monroe leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. The name Celeste Hart rang faintly in his memory, tugging at the edges of something he'd long buried. He had known a Celeste many years ago, a quiet, artistic woman with a captivating smile. But it had been fleeting, a relationship that fizzled out as their lives diverged. Could this girl truly be the result of that long-ago connection? "I'll need to review this evidence," he said, his voice strained. "Clear the courtroom." The bailiff immediately moved to enforce the order, ushering the reporters and onlookers out. Leila remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression steady despite the tension swirling around her. Once the doors shut, and the room was emptied of spectators, Judge Monroe turned back to her. "Miss Hart," he began cautiously, "do you understand the seriousness of what you've just claimed?" "Yes," she replied simply. Her confidence was unnerving for someone so young. Judge Monroe glanced at Ms. Gaines. "You mentioned evidence." Ms. Gaines opened her briefcase and produced a small stack of papers, sliding them across the table to the judge. "Your Honor, these include a letter written by Miss Hart before her passing and a DNA test conducted using genetic material from Leela and her late mother. The results indicate a 99.9% probability of biological relation to you." His hands trembled as he picked up the documents. His eyes scanned the familiar handwriting on the letter addressed to him, his breath catching in his throat. ***, dear Daniel. If you're reading this, it means I've run out of time to tell you myself. I never wanted to burden you, but life has a way of making decisions for us. Our daughter, Leela, deserves to know where she came from. She deserves to know you. I never told you because I thought I was protecting us both. You had your dreams, and I didn't want to complicate your life. But now, I see how unfair that was, to you and to her. She's bright, kind, and stronger than I ever could have imagined. She's the best of you and the best of me. Please, don't let her face the world without knowing she has you. Always. Celeste ***. Judge Monroe stared at the letter, the words blurring as tears stung his eyes. The DNA report beneath it only confirmed what he already knew in his heart. His world, meticulously built on order and discipline, was crumbling before him. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know about her." "I believe you, Your Honor," Ms. Gaines said softly. "But the fact remains that Leela has no other family. She needs someone who can step in, not just as her guardian, but as her father." The judge looked at Leela, who was watching him intently. Her gaze wasn't accusing or angry. It was filled with hope. He felt a pang of guilt and something else he couldn't yet name, perhaps the stirrings of a bond he hadn't realized he craved. "I'll need time," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Time to process this." Ms. Gaines nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. But I urge you to consider that time is not something Leela has in abundance. She's spent her life waiting for answers." Judge Monroe exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The gavel that once symbolized his authority now felt like a lead weight in his hand. This wasn't just a legal case. This was a reckoning, a moment that would change his life. And hers, forever. The shattering passed. The courtroom had emptied, leaving only silence and the echoes of what had just transpired. Judge Daniel Monroe sat frozen behind the bench, the weight of Leela Hart's revelation pressing down on his chest like an immovable stone. "You're my dad." Those words had shattered years of carefully cultivated order in a single instant. He had always prided himself on his discipline, his meticulous approach to justice, and his unwavering composure. But now, that facade was cracking, and Daniel wasn't sure how to hold it together. The bailiff cleared his throat. "Your Honor, shall I adjourn the court for the day?" Daniel blinked, as if waking from a daze. "No," he said hoarsely. We'll resume after a recess." He stood abruptly, his black robe swirling around him as he retreated toward his chambers. Behind the heavy oak doors of his office, Daniel collapsed into his leather chair. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and buried his face in his hands. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, fragments of a past he had long left behind. Celeste Hart. It had been more than 12 years since he'd last seen her. She had been a bright, enigmatic woman with a love for painting and a quiet resilience that had drawn him in during law school. Their relationship had been passionate but short-lived, a casualty of his relentless ambition and her desire to find her own path. They had parted on amicable terms, or so he had thought. He had assumed she moved on, just as he had. But now, it seemed there was a piece of their history he had never known, a living, breathing child who had grown up without him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice strained. The door opened, and Ms. Gaines stepped inside, followed by Leila. The girl's expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I thought it best to speak privately," Ms. Gaines said. Leela wanted to explain herself. Daniel gestured toward the chairs across from his desk. Please, sit. Leela hesitated for a moment before perching on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ms. Gaines took the seat beside her, offering silent support. I'm sorry if I upset you, Leela said softly. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Daniel shook his head. You didn't upset me, Leela. I was just surprised. This is a lot to process. I understand, she said, but I had to find you. My mom always told me you were a good man. She said you didn't know about me, but that if you did, you'd care. Daniel's throat tightened. She told you about me. Leela nodded. She said you were smart and kind, and that you loved helping people. Her voice wavered. She got sick a few years ago. Cancer. She didn't want to tell me much at first, but when she knew she didn't have much time left, she told me everything. She said I should find you when I was ready. Daniel's heart ached at the thought of Celeste facing such a devastating illness alone. He felt a surge of guilt for not being there, even though he hadn't known. I wish I had known, he said quietly. I would have been there for both of you. Leela's eyes softened. You're here now. Those simple words struck him deeply. Here was this brave, resilient girl offering him forgiveness before he had even earned it. Ms. Gaines cleared her throat gently. Your Honor, I know this is a lot to take in, but there are practical matters we need to discuss. Leila has no immediate family left. The state is prepared to place her in foster care if no suitable guardian steps forward. Daniel's stomach clenched. The idea of Lila being shuffled through the foster system was unbearable. She deserved stability, love, and a chance to heal from the loss of her mother. What are the options? He asked, his voice firmer now. Well, Ms. Gaines said carefully, you are her biological father. You have the legal right to petition for custody, but that's not a decision to be made lightly. It would require a commitment. Parenting a child is no small task. Daniel looked at Leela, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Could he do this? Could he be the father she needed after all these years? His life had been defined by the law, by the rigid structure of courtrooms and legal briefs. Fatherhood was an entirely different kind of responsibility. But as he looked into Layla's eyes, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from her. I need time to figure this out, he admitted. But I want to be part of your life, Layla. If you'll let me. Her face lit up with a tentative smile. I'd like that. Ms. Gaines nodded approvingly. We'll work out the details. For now, I think Leela's bravery today deserves some recognition. Daniel managed a small smile. I couldn't agree more. Later that evening, after Leela and Ms. Gaines had left, Daniel sat alone in his office, the weight of the day settling over him. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old photo album. Flipping through its pages, he found a picture of himself and Celeste from their time in law school. They were smiling, carefree, with the world ahead of them. He traced Celeste's face with his finger, grief mingling with regret. I should have known, he whispered. But life didn't offer rewinds, only second chances. And this was his. As he closed the album, Daniel made a silent promise. To Celeste, to himself, and most importantly, to Leela. He would figure this out. He would be the father she deserved. Tomorrow, he would begin to make things right. Bridging the gap. The next morning, the world outside the courthouse was drenched in golden light, but Judge Daniel Monroe's thoughts were heavy. Sleep had eluded him as he replayed every moment from the previous day. The shock, the letter from Celeste, and Leela's brave declaration. His life had shifted on its axis, and there was no turning back. He stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie. The reflection staring back at him was that of a man used to commanding a courtroom, not comforting a child who had just lost her mother. Fatherhood wasn't something he had ever imagined for himself. Yet here it was, thrust upon him without warning. As he drove toward the courthouse, his fingers drummed anxiously on the steering wheel. Today, he would meet with Ms. Gaines and Leela at a neutral setting, something less intimidating than the courthouse. A coffee shop downtown had been chosen as the meeting place, and Daniel hoped the informal atmosphere would ease the tension. The smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted him as he walked into the cozy cafe. The hum of conversation and clinking cups created a warm, welcoming ambience. He spotted Ms. Gaines sitting by the window, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Lila was next to her, sipping from a mug that dwarfed her small hands. Daniel approached the table, his heart racing. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. Ms. Gaines smiled politely. "Good morning, Your Honor." "Just Daniel, please," he insisted, pulling out a chair. Leela looked up from her drink, her eyes bright but cautious. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi, Leela," he replied, his tone gentle. "How are you doing today?" She shrugged. "Okay, I guess." He nodded, unsure of how to bridge the chasm between them. "I'm glad you agreed to meet me." Leela glanced at Ms. Gaines, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I wanted to," she admitted. "I've got a lot of questions." "That's fair," Daniel said, "and I'll do my best to answer them." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the soft clatter of dishes around them. Leela fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve before speaking again. "Why didn't you know about me?" she asked bluntly. Daniel's throat tightened. "That's a good question," he admitted. "Your mom and I, we cared about each other a lot, but our lives went in different directions. She never told me she was pregnant. If she had, I promise I would have been there for you." Leela's brow furrowed. "Didn't you ever wonder about her?" "I did," he said honestly, "but I assumed she was happy wherever life took her. I never imagined she was raising a child, raising you, on her own." Leela's expression softened, though traces of hurt lingered. "She was a good mom," she said proudly. "She worked really hard, and she always made time for me." Daniel smiled faintly. "She sounds amazing. I'm sorry I didn't get to know her the way you did." "You'd have liked her," Leela said. "She always said you were really smart and stubborn." Daniel chuckled despite himself. She wasn't wrong about that. Ms. Gaines cleared her throat gently. "Leela, why don't you tell Daniel about some of the things you like to do?" Leela hesitated but then began talking about her love for reading, especially mystery novels, and her passion for sketching. As she spoke, Daniel felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest. He realized he wanted to know everything about her, the little details that made her who she was. "You sound like you're pretty creative," Daniel said. "Maybe you got that from your mom." "Maybe," Leela said with a shy smile. "But I think I'm good at solving puzzles too, like figuring people out." "Really?" Daniel leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you think about me so far?" Leela tilted her head, studying him with a seriousness that was both endearing and disarming. "I think you're nervous," she said matter-of-factly. "But you're trying." Daniel's breath caught. "You're right on both counts. I think I like you," she added softly, "but I'm still figuring it out." He nodded solemnly. "That's fair. I'm still figuring things out too." After an hour of conversation, Ms. Gaines glanced at her watch. "I think this was a good start," she said, "but we have to head back soon." Daniel stood as they prepared to leave. "Leela," he said, "I'd like to spend more time with you if you're okay with that. Maybe we can go to the park or do something you enjoy." Leela's eyes lit up. "I'd like that." "Great," Daniel said, feeling a surge of relief. "We'll figure out a time that works." As they walked toward the exit, Ms. Gaines lingered behind, giving Daniel a moment alone with Leela. "You know," Leela said, "I used to wonder what it would be like to have a dad. I didn't think I'd ever find out." Daniel's heart clenched. "I'm glad you found me, Leela. And I promise I won't let you down." She looked up at him, her expression filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "I hope not." That evening, as Daniel sat in his quiet home, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Leela had given him a chance to be a father, to build a connection that had been lost before it even began. And he was determined not to waste it. A new bond takes shape. The next weekend arrived faster than Daniel had anticipated. Despite the hectic schedule of court cases and legal responsibilities, Leela had been on his mind constantly. He was determined to make their first outing meaningful, hoping it would be a step toward bridging the gap between them. He stood in his kitchen, nervously staring at a list he jotted down. Park, museum, bookstore, ice cream. He wanted options, unsure what Leela would prefer. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, marking each second as he wrestled with his self-doubt. Was he overthinking it? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When Daniel opened it, Ms. Gaines stood with Leela beside her, a duffel bag slung over the girl's shoulder. Leela wore a simple hoodie and jeans, her hair braided neatly. "Good morning," Ms. Gaines greeted warmly. "Ready for your day together?" "Yeah," Daniel said, though his nerves made his voice waver slightly. Leela gave him a small smile. "Hi." "Hey," he said, stepping aside. "Come on in." As Leela entered, Ms. Gaines gave Daniel a reassuring nod. "I'll be back to pick her up this evening. Have fun." When the door closed, silence hung in the air between them. "So," Daniel said, trying to sound casual, "I thought we could go to the park, maybe grab some ice cream after. How does that sound?" Leela shrugged. "Sure." Her reserved response didn't discourage him. He knew trust wouldn't be built overnight. The park was alive with laughter and the rustling of leaves as a gentle breeze swept through the trees. Children chased each other across the grass, and families gathered for picnics. Daniel and Leela walked along a paved path, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. "I used to come to this park when I was younger," Daniel said, hoping to spark a conversation. "It's changed a bit, but the lake is still the same." Leela glanced at the shimmering water. "It's nice." They walked in comfortable silence for a while before spotting a row of swings. "Do you want to swing for a bit?" Daniel asked. Leela's eyes brightened slightly. "Okay." As she sat on the swing, Daniel gave her a gentle push. Her laughter, soft but genuine, filled the air as she soared higher. "You're pretty good at this," he said with a chuckle. "I used to go to the playground a lot with my mom," Leela said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "She'd push me on the swings until I was dizzy." Daniel's heart ached at the mention of Celeste. "She sounds like she was an amazing mom." "She was," Leela said softly. "I miss her." "I bet," Daniel said gently. "It's okay to miss her. I miss her too." Leela glanced back at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she'd be okay with this, us hanging out?" Daniel nodded firmly. "I think she'd be happy. She wanted the best for you, and I'm going to do my best to be here for you." Leela was quiet for a moment before saying, "I think she'd like that." After the park, they made their way to a local ice cream shop. The walls were painted in vibrant colors, and the air was thick with the sweet aroma of waffle cones. "What flavor do you want?" Daniel asked as they approached the counter. "Mint chocolate chip," Leela said without hesitation. "Good choice," Daniel said with a grin. "That's my favorite too." Leela's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" "Absolutely. It's the perfect mix of refreshing and sweet," he said as he placed their order. They found a cozy booth by the window. Leela took a bite of her ice cream, savoring the taste. "So," Daniel said, "tell me more about what you like to do. I know you love reading and drawing. What else?" Leela licked her spoon thoughtfully. "I like puzzles. And science stuff. I was in a robotics club at school before everything happened." "That's impressive," Daniel said. "I always admired people who could build things. I wasn't very good at it myself." Leela smirked. "Maybe I can teach you sometime." "I'd like that," Daniel said sincerely. As they continued talking, Daniel felt the walls between them slowly beginning to crumble. Lila's laughter came more easily, and her stories painted a picture of a bright, curious girl who had faced more challenges than most kids her age. When they finished their ice cream, Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "There's something I want you to know, Lila." She tilted her head, curious. "I'm not perfect," he admitted. "I'm going to mess up sometimes, but I want to be here for you. I want to be someone you can count on." Lila's gaze softened. "I think you're doing okay so far." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with hope. "Thanks. That means a lot." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they returned to Daniel's house. Ms. Gaines was waiting in the driveway, her expression pleased as she saw them approach. "How did it go?" she asked. "Pretty good," Daniel said, glancing at Lila. "Yeah," Lila agreed, her smile small but genuine. Ms. Gaines beamed. "That's wonderful to hear." Before getting into the car, Lila turned to Daniel. "Thanks for today." "Anytime," he said warmly. "We'll do it again soon." As the car pulled away, Daniel watched until it disappeared down the street. His heart was lighter than it had been in days. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning filled with promise. And Daniel was determined to make the most of every moment. Opening the heart. The following weeks marked a shift in Daniel and Lila's relationship. Their days together became routine. Afternoons at the park, museum visits, and quiet evenings filled with laughter over puzzles and sketchbooks. The walls of uncertainty that had once loomed between them began to crumble. Still, Daniel sensed there were parts of Lila's heart she kept guarded, pieces she wasn't ready to share. Tonight, Daniel invited Lila for dinner at his home. He'd even attempted to cook, something he hadn't done in years. The aroma of spaghetti and garlic bread filled the house, mingling with the soft sound of jazz playing from the speakers. Lila sat at the kitchen island, sketching something in her notebook. Her pencil moved with precision, the lines forming what looked like a futuristic robot. "That looks impressive," Daniel said as he stirred the sauce. "Thanks," Lila said without looking up. "It's a security bot. It can detect danger before it happens." Daniel chuckled. "Sounds like something the courthouse could use." Lila grinned faintly. "Yeah, maybe." As they sat down to eat, Daniel noticed how natural it felt, like they'd been doing this for years. Lila twirled her fork in the spaghetti, her appetite hearty despite the quiet mood lingering between them. "Good?" Daniel asked. "Pretty good," Lila admitted. "Better than I expected from a judge." Daniel laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." For a while, they ate in companionable silence until Lila's expression grew serious. She set her fork down and looked at him intently. "Daniel," she began, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, setting his own fork aside. "Why did my mom never tell you about me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with years of unanswered pain. Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've thought about that a lot since you found me," he admitted. "The truth is, your mom and I had different lives. I was just starting my career as a judge, and she was focused on building a life for herself. We cared about each other, but I think she made a decision to raise you on her own because she thought it was best at the time." Lila's brow furrowed. "Do you think she was wrong?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't think she was wrong. She did an incredible job raising you. But I wish I had known. I would have wanted to be there for both of you." Lila nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "I guess I always wondered if maybe she didn't tell you because you wouldn't have cared." Daniel's heart ached at the thought. "Lila, I would have cared. I care now. I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." Her eyes shimmered with emotion, but she blinked it away. "It's weird, you know, having someone who wants to be my dad all of a sudden." "I get that," Daniel said gently. "It's weird for me too. But I'm willing to figure it out if you are." Lila's lips curved into a small smile. "Okay, but don't get too sappy on me, okay?" Daniel laughed. "Deal." After dinner, They moved to the living room. Lila sprawled on the couch with her sketchbook, while Daniel sat nearby, flipping through legal briefs he needed to review. The atmosphere was warm, filled with the quiet hum of contentment. "You know," Lila said suddenly, "you're not as boring as I thought judges were." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Boring, huh? Well, you wear that robe and bang the gavel. It's kind of dramatic." He chuckled. "Fair point. But we do a lot more than just bang gavels." "Like what?" "Like listen to people's stories and try to make the right decisions. It's not always easy, but it's important." Lila nodded thoughtfully. "I guess that's kind of cool." "Thanks, I'll take that as a compliment," Daniel said playfully. As the evening wore on, Lila's eyes grew heavy. She yawned, her head sinking against the armrest. "You falling asleep on me?" Daniel teased. "Maybe," she murmured. "Come on," he said, standing up. "I'll drag you back to Ms. Gaines's place." Lila rubbed her eyes. "Can I stay a little longer? Just until I wake up more." Daniel's heart swelled at the request. Of course. As she drifted off to sleep, Daniel sat quietly, watching the rise and fall of her breath. The house, once filled with only the echoes of his solitary existence, now felt alive. He realized then how much Lila had changed his life in such a short time. She had brought color and warmth into a world that had grown cold and predictable. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. A heartfelt resolution. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the living room window, casting a warm glow across the hardwood floor. Daniel sat quietly in his armchair, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Across from him, Lila was curled up on the couch, her sketchbook resting on her lap as she doodled absent-mindedly. The silence between them was comfortable, but Daniel knew there was still unfinished business. Truths left unsaid, and feelings yet to be fully explored. "You know," Lila began without looking up, "I used to think dads were like superheroes." Daniel's eyebrows lifted. "Really?" "Yeah," she said with a small smile. "When I was little, I'd see other kids with their dads at school events. They'd lift them onto their shoulders or teach them how to ride bikes. I imagined mine was off fighting crime or something cool like that." Daniel's heart clenched. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for those moments, Lila." She shrugged, but her voice was softer. "It's not your fault. I guess I just always wondered what it would be like to have someone around, you know." "I do know," he said quietly. "And I want to be that someone for you now. I can't change the past, but I'm here for whatever comes next." Lila's pencil stilled on the page. "It's scary," she admitted, "letting someone in." "I get that," Daniel said. "It's scary for me too. But we don't have to figure everything out right away. We can take it one day at a time." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "You promise?" "I promise," he said firmly. "And I'm a judge, remember? I take promises seriously." Lila laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Okay, but don't start making me follow court rules or anything." "Deal," Daniel said with a grin. Later that afternoon, they drove back to Ms. Gaines's house. The air was crisp, and the trees lining the street swayed gently in the breeze. Lila stared out the window, her expression thoughtful. When they arrived, Ms. Gaines greeted them warmly from the porch. "How was your time together?" she asked. "Good," Lila said, glancing at Daniel with a smile. "Really good." "I'm glad to hear that," Ms. Gaines said, her eyes twinkling. Daniel knelt slightly to meet Lila's gaze. "I'll see you next weekend." "Yeah," she said softly. "Thanks for everything." "Anytime," Daniel assured her. As Lila walked toward the house, she paused and turned back. "Hey, Daniel." "Yeah." "I'm glad I found you," she said simply. Daniel's throat tightened, and he fought to keep his voice steady. "Me too, Lila. Me too." That evening, Daniel sat alone in his living room, reflecting on the whirlwind of changes that had entered his life. He thought about Celeste, about the love and strength she had poured into raising Layla on her own. A sudden thought struck him. Celeste had left him a gift, even in her absence. Layla was a living testament to her courage and resilience. And now, Daniel had been given the chance to honor that gift by being the father Layla needed. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting his thoughts. A message from Layla popped up. "Thanks for today. See you soon, Dad." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he read the last word. Dad. It wasn't just a title. It was a promise. One he intended to keep. And in that moment, Daniel knew their story was just beginning. A story filled with healing, love, and the unbreakable bond they had finally found.